The town of Boulogne is flourishing. The buildings are in good repair, the place on the whole is cheerful, and the environ's pleasing.
That's Arthur Young on Boulogne. Not very revealing. No clues there as to why France would erupt in revolt. But from Boulogne, Arthur Young headed out into the countryside. And pretty soon he put his finger on the problems of pre-revolutionary France.
I had imagined that nobody but farmers and labourers lived in the country, but I was wrong. My first journey showed me a score of country estates. They are furnished at great expense. Yet all around are pitiful scenes. Miserable housing, peasants like walking dunghills. You pass at once from grandeur to beggary, from the most splendid luxury to misery in mud cabins.
Misery in mud cabins. It's a pretty grim image. Was it true?
Well, here's a fact. 80% of people in pre-revolutionary France were peasants. A few worked their own land, most worked other people's, and they had to pay half of what they produced each year in rent to the local landowner. Add to that taxes paid to the state and to the church, there wasn't much left.
Meanwhile, the nobles in their chateau didn't pay tax at all. That was their privilege. The theory was they fought for the king in times of war, they paid their tax in blood. But by the 1780s, that whole idea was out of date. And anyway, the honest system was corrupt. If you had money, you could buy lands and titles. You could buy privilege.
So the rich got richer.
And the poor got poorer.
Literally. In the 50 years before 1789, prices and rents rose by a half. Wages went up just a quarter. People were hungry. Some were starving.
Arthur Young thought this was a disgrace. He was a farmer. He was familiar with the latest farming techniques used in England to increase food production, but it seemed the French nobility were ignoring their responsibilities.
The great lords love too much their forests, their boars, their huntsmen. They can't be bothered to manage their farms properly, or look after the peasants. You find fields wasted, whole estates no better than a desert. Oh, if I were king of France for a day, I'd make these lords jump.
And then there was the church. The church too was immensely rich. And like the nobility, members of the church were privileged. They didn't pay tax either. This is Saint-Germain, once the richest abbey in France. The abbot here earned 300,000 livres a year, a fortune in those days. Arthur Young came here to admire the pillars of African marble, but the extravagance he witnessed stuck in his throat.
I lose my patience at the abuse of such wealth. Just a quarter of this income would establish a noble farm. What turnips? What cabbages? And are these things not better than a fat priest?
Privilege and poverty. That's how Young sums it up. This print makes the same point. The nobility and the clergy riding on the backs of the peasantry. And Young could feel the rising tide of resentment, the call for reform. He wrote of
a great ferment amongst all ranks of men, all too eager for change.
But how would change come? With no parliament, no elections, who had the power to push through reform?